Because of the nature of the rewrite, we do not even know if the general timeline of events prior to these wars in the name of imperialism is true. The timeline for many events around the world was artificially extended to give more credence to the idea of a centuries-long process of colonization, and to distract from the fact that until the reset, there was a unified civilization of multiple independent cultures that traded peacefully with each other. The supposedly new technological knowledge was introduced worldwide in the course of the 19th century, first and foremost in Western Europe and the Americas. An important role in the reintroduction of the old technologies, in the new guise of energy scarcity, was played by the world's fairs. From 1851 onwards, countless world exhibitions were held. Today, this tradition still exists in the form of the expos, but in principle they no longer play a role, since there have been no real technological breakthroughs since the two world wars, with the exception of information technology, which is being deliberately developed to bring the dystopian vision of transhumanism to the world. It can be said that with World War I, not only classical architecture, but also innovation disappeared from the world. Before industrialization, there was only one form of sophisticated architecture in the world, known today as historicism or revival architecture, because according to the official narrative, virtually all of these buildings were created only in the 19th century, supposedly as a recourse to ancient Greco-Roman architectural trends. Neo-Gothic, Neo-Renaissance, Neo-Baroque, etc. The basic principles of these buildings were always the same and their quality unrivaled. Is this uniform architecture an indication of a unified civilization that only recently broke up into individual kingdoms or nation-states? Even in Japan, there were these Greco-Roman classical buildings before 1900, although Japan was still completely isolated from the outside world until around 1850. And even after that, after the British had forcibly conquered Japan, it only slowly and hesitantly opened up to the West. The colonization of the world did not take place until 1700 at the earliest, but was backdated by the falsifiers of history on behalf of the imperial powers. Imperialism developed as a reaction to an event, possibly a war or a natural disaster, which wiped out the old, so-called ancient world and left a power vacuum. Western Europe managed to emerge from this vacuum as a winner. Imperialism was kind of a worldwide raid by the Western European powers to grab the countries of the world that had been devastated by the catastrophe. The conflicts between the individual colonial powers, Spain, Portugal, England, Germany, etc., that have been handed down historically are part of the game of hide-and-seek played by the European power elite organized in secret societies and shadow organizations. But these conflicts took place only on a superficial political level because, as is the case today, public decision-makers were rarely privy to the real plans. Let us now look at the story of two buildings. Penn Station in New York, built between 1904 and 1910, demolished in 1963 because the building was dirty and the maintenance costs could allegedly no longer be met. Built in the Greco-Roman style. Ada Louise Huxtable wrote in the New York Times in 1963.
The tragedy is that our present age not only could not produce such a building, but could not even maintain it. Ada Huxtable.
Erie County Savings Building, built in 1893 in the neo-Romanesque style. We read about the demolition of the Erie County Savings Bank building in 1968 in the Buffalo Evening News.
Every evening for more than 3 months, a battle was fought in Shelton Square between her and 2 cavernous cranes. The latter attacked with 2 primitive means of offense, a pair of jaws and a rock, or in modern wreckers' parlance, a clam bucket and a busting ball. The former weighed in at 3 tons, the latter at 3.5. The fight was one of the toughest in veteran wreckers' memory. For a wrecker to admit resistance is like a weightlifter confessing his muscles are getting flabby. It began at 4:30 in the afternoon and continued through 7:30 the next morning, 5 days a week. A crowd of variable size would gather to see the kill. It was the show of the town. Whole families arrived in station wagons from the suburbs. The original plans of the building were made available when the crane operations of the 25-man demolition crew began to munch at the building, however. It was evident that plans and reality did not agree. The roof, with its turrets and gargoyles and finials, was the toughest. A finial, lifted intact like a birthday candle to the ground, measured 3.5 feet high and weighed an estimated 600 pounds. Not to mention the cones on the towers, which looked like cake frosting aloft, but on the ground measured 20 feet high and 15 feet across. Cast iron and steel. As the wrecking progressed, scores of 200-pound red granite carved images, 5 feet thick, set in the walls around the crest of the building, came tumbling down, their carnival faces of joy and sorrow biting the dust. The very stones of the building were resistant. The walls, which tapered from 9 feet at the base up to 3 feet, were composed of foot-thick red granite stones weighing up to 3 tons each. Interlocked, they had to be lifted out like lumps of sugar, piece by piece. They did not sound like sugar when they dropped.
If we look at the bigger picture, the 2 world wars appear in a new light. The colonization of the world took place later than we are told, only in the 1700s. By the early 1900s, most of the world was under the control of the European elite-controlled colonial powers, primarily England, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Belgium, Portugal, Russia, Italy. These nations were all already infiltrated by secret societies. Then, with the 2 world wars, European culture itself was largely destroyed, and as a result, people were deprived of the ability to remember. The wars created a collective trauma that made it difficult to connect with the pre-war period. If we look at the earliest photographs from the former colonies, particularly India, we see a world in ruins and people who are not suited to the structures in which they live. These photos resemble 18th and 19th century landscapes of Europe. If we ignore the official timeline for a moment, we can entertain the thought that our world was laid in ruins not too long ago, and that this event allowed parasitic forces to establish a new world order. This new world order is still in the making, and has as its goal the complete uprooting of man from his being and his history. The 19th century saw the conquest of the last part of the Tartar Empire by the Russian Empire. The independent, or free Tartary, as it was called on the old maps, was located until about 1870 directly east of the Caspian Sea in the territory of today's Uzbekistan, with cities like Samarkand and Bukhara. However, Tartary is not mentioned in the official history of Uzbekistan. Anatoly Fomenko writes on the subject of independent Tartary. A few decades later, the Soviets, on behalf of the cabal, destroyed large parts of the Central Asian remnants of the Old World in the name of communism. The First Anglo-Afghan War, the settlement of New Zealand and Australia, and the gold rush in the American West also fall within this period. Consequences of industrialization. In 1839, John D. Rockefeller Sr. was born in the United States. He later founded the Standard Oil Company in 1870. The World's Fairs coincided with the power struggle for authority in physics and the monopolization of energy production, with the sinking of the Titanic and the founding of the Federal Reserve Bank. At that time, the cabal got rid of those industrialists who opposed the plan of establishing a new world order. The three most prominent opponents of the establishment of the Federal Reserve Bank, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, and John Jacob Astor, all died with the sinking of the Titanic. The Titanic belonged to J.P. Morgan, one of the string pullers behind the creation of the Fed, who spontaneously decided against being present at the maiden voyage. In 1910, the first plans for the foundation of the Fed took place on Jekyll Island. In April 1912, the Titanic sank. In reality, her sister ship, the Olympic, sank. And a year later, in 1913, the Fed was founded with the passing of the Federal Reserve Act, thus laying the foundation for the arbitrary control of the world economy by the secret elite, which had already infiltrated most nations at that time. Woodrow Wilson signed the act, allowing the Fed to issue Federal Reserve notes, U.S. dollars. A few months later, the First World War began the civilizational decline in Central Europe. Nations were set against each other. In 1866, Otto von Bismarck led Prussia into the German War of Brothers against Austria. After the end of this fratricidal war, he did not include Austria in the newly formed North German Confederation and annexed Alsace-Lorraine. He thus created, possibly without being aware of it, the structural conditions for the First and Second World Wars. However, the assassination attempt on Bismarck and his dismissal by Wilhelm II indicate that he was a thorn in the side of the secret societies. His anti-Catholic policy of the Kulturkampf may also have contributed to this. The war against the Germans started with Rome's propaganda against the supposedly primitive Germania and continued with the Reformation Wars. Bismarck tried to reduce the influence of the Vatican and secret societies. The final nail in the coffin of Germany were the two world wars, followed by controlled migration and population replacement. In the course of the 30 Years' War, Germany's spiritual backbone was broken. As Heinrich Heine said, "Bondage is in the German himself, in his soul. Worse than material slavery is spiritualized slavery. Germans must be liberated from within. Nothing helps from without."